3, 2, 1. Podcast number 2. Who is Jon Ray with Richard Jones? I like how silky and milky it sounds.
His voice gets so sexy when you introduce. I had no idea that was going to happen.
Yeah. Well, thanks for doing this, brother.
Well, it's so nice to see you.
I'm looking at a very handsome man. We're overlooking downtown Austin. He's got a nice salt and pepper beard. Who are you?
Well, my name's Richard Jones. I do some acting, some producing, mostly in the film community. Also do a little improv, and then I'm a husband and have 2 kids who are 8 and one will soon be 6 in the next week.
Cool.
So.
And you and I met a long time. Did we meet in an acting class?
I was Ben Taylor's acting class.
Yeah, Ben Taylor's acting class, which was this really cool acting class that was like a writer-actor workshop. So you had to write your own scenes, and then we would all collectively act them out. And yeah, I think that was a really good experience for me of just kind of starting to have some personal awareness, because I was really spinning off the planet at that time. I think that's when I was at the pinnacle of drugs and alcohol before I became a teetotaler. And so I can remember being in that class and like barely trying to keep my life together, but having this really interesting kind of personal awareness through the acting experience of, okay, I have to know who my character is, which means that I have to somewhat know who I am so that I can make the transition between the two. But yeah, Ben Taylor was a really good guy, and I also met my girlfriend in that class.
Yeah, Shonda.
Yeah. Shonda. A lot of good things came out of that class. What drew you to acting or brought you into kind of the filmmaking world?
Well, for me, I studied journalism in college, and I'd kind of been involved with like a high school television thing. And I thought journalism done well has a ability to shift people's paradigms and make them think. And there's a power in like investigative journalism and doing some of that stuff. And then I did an internship with NBC, and I realized all those guys' family lives are horrible. Like, if you want to have a dysfunctional family life, go be a journalist, because if there's anything that's happening that's of any note, whatever's happening in your personal life dies at that moment, and you go follow that. And if there's nothing happening, well, there's a 24-hour news cycle, and so you better make something because we need content.
Yeah.
And so there's no break. There's no it's like a veterinarian, it's like, well, but the horse is sick, I gotta go get the horse, but it's like, but I can take, there's nothing really happening today, I can take a little time off for myself, go fishing. No.
As most veterinarians want to do.
They love animals, except when they're killing them. No. So...
Pull that microphone a little bit closer to you.
Does it need to go closer?
Yeah.
What? Yeah, so then I kind of was in a total funk of like trying to figure out what I was going to do, and I ended up getting involved with this ministry and doing video production for them and getting to editing and discovering my artistic side through that, which I hadn't really known. Like, I'd only been rejected artistically up to that point in my life. And so through editing actors on that, I thought, I think I'd like to try that. So I was like 26 and took my first acting class, which was with Mona Lee. And it was through her that I ended up getting like some representation later. I started taking it seriously even a little late. You're like dabble one class and then another class here. And then Ben Taylor's was the second acting coach that I worked with.
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting how closely linked to the acting world, at least in my experience, when I was doing a lot of acting, rejection is, and kind of your ability to properly process that rejection. Is it something that you ever get used to, or like how do you deal with the massive amount of rejection that come? Because it may not even be rejection like you're not good. It's just like, that's not the color beard we wanted.
No, totally. It's really hard not to take it personally some days. Like, I've thought about making the short film where at the end, like, they just come out with this giant, like, spear and just stab the actor that doesn't get the part, because that's what it feels like sometimes. It's like, I was in this audition, and it was like a second level. It's a callback, and they come out to us, and I thought I was going to get to go again. And they're like, oh, no, you can go. He's going to stay. And it was just like, I mean, if she'd just run out with a big spear and just shoved it through my chest, it would have felt probably similar to how I felt in that moment. Because It's like, you're getting up and you're like, this means I'm voted off the island, and that guy's staying here to keep working. Okay.
Yeah, and it really is that direct. It's not like they sugarcoat it at all.
Oh, and I been asked to audition through a friend, and I was gonna call him up on. I called him back on the way. I was like, "Hey, thanks, man, for getting me a chance to audition with this project." And I just feel like I'm bleeding, like while I'm driving, and anyway. So but I think also being on the other side of the camera some and helping with some auditions, like I've seen people be like, I don't like the color shirt that guy's wearing, and you're like, we can change that on set, right? Like. That's which I think that happens a lot more in commercial auditions where you have a ton of people giving input that they just know they're being paid to be there and they need to say something. And sometimes they say something that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think that definitely, my experience in the film industry is that everybody is trying to make themselves feel important because especially on a big budget project, you have a lot of people who are just standing around a lot of the time. The philosophy of hurry up and wait is very much alive and well in the film industry. But even in corporate America and working in like Silicon Valley, it's the same thing where the advice that I always got was leave a couple of obvious mistakes in your work so that you can give the people who are standing around something to correct so that they correct something that you know about instead of something that really didn't need to be fixed.
Is that called a dead dog? When
is that the term for it? I hope so because I like
throw out a dead dog and your fear is that you throw out a dead dog and they're like, well, I love that one dead. And you're like, oh. God, no.
Yeah.
But it's supposed to be to give them that chance to say something that's like, can we not use Comic Sans? And
yeah.
And then you're like, yeah, sure. Yeah, we can change that from Comic Sans.
Yeah.
That's a brilliant input on your part. Good job. Yeah, I'll look into something else, some Helvetica New or something.
Yeah, well, and, one of the reasons that I feel like I am always gravitating more towards entrepreneurial efforts is because I really couldn't stand kind of the, for lack of a better term, bullshit that happens in a lot of those circles where people are just trying to validate their own existence. And, one of the ways that I'm really trying to view reality is through this lens of reality is this mirror that's constantly showing me kind of the emotional trauma or what Eastern philosophy calls samskaras, which are kind of this energy that gets trapped in your nervous system. And so this is all metaphysically and woo-woo, but the practical application of it, especially when you're going into an interview process or when you're in an audition, is that whatever happens here is mirroring to me something that I need to know about myself. And I saw this kind of arc in the 10 or so years that I was doing acting, where at first I was just completely devastated anytime I didn't get an audition, especially if it was something that I really wanted. And then slowly, as I started to do kind of this inner work, I felt like it became like I wasn't taking things as personally. And I've been calling that being transparent to life. So I would be really conscious of how did this rejection make me feel, and when are all of the times that I've felt a similar way that I do now, and try to burn all of that out of my nervous system. And whether that was a symptom of just psychosomatics or whether that was actually doing something, it allowed me to then start walking into auditions knowing that I was going to show up the best that I knew how to show up, and that the rejection was less about me and more about, all of the different characteristics that go into choosing somebody, and also the politics of it, because I think the film world is highly political. All that to say, I'd be curious to hear, in front of the camera as an actor and behind the camera as a filmmaker producer, like, do you find that you're more empathetic towards actors, having been one yourself?
It depends on the actor. Well, I think it's I am empathetic to anybody that I feel like is behaving reasonably. I guess But I think it's probably given me more empathy for the directors and being on that side, or even having produced or directed some things of having to reject actors. because having to reject people is also something that's not easy or fun.
Mm-hmm.
And so, especially when I would have friends or try to do a casting, or, I made a little web series here or whatever, and have people be like, hey, I've got a great idea for how I could be in your web series. And you'd be like, cool. Like, part of me wants that for you, but part of me is trying to figure out what's best for what I'm trying to make here, or for this film, or for whatever. And so, like that really is tough, and trying to decide. On one hand, with film, you're wanting to create things with your friends that create this collaborative community and making art. And on the other hand, you're trying to make the best art possible, or also climb some sort of ladder of, creating quality that can help create more opportunities for you. And I've seen people go both ways on that. I've seen people hire all their friends. I've seen people make decisions to hire like almost none of their friends, and I've seen both of those have varied level of success, so who knows? But yeah, I think I think what I love about acting itself is that it is empathy, like the idea of trying to understand this Vietnam guy that's going to murder all these people, and get into how easily I could become that person. Like, you have to come to it from like this guy's an asshole. You can't do that. You've got to be like, this guy is trying to do the best. I had a role with like a sniper, and I went out and I took a deer rifle and I shot logs in a river and pretended they were people. To imagine what it's like to take a life, but also to try to get to a point where you've done it so many times that they're like logs to you, and thinking through that. And then I had this little kid with me who was Ryan. Oh gosh, I can't think of his last name right now. Anyway, he actually has done some really cool stuff. He was in blah blah. But like, to be an a-hole to him in the name of like protecting him, the idea of like, he's gruff and simplistic in him, but he's also seen other little kids die. And like, how does that impact, like just all those things of trying to get myself to a place of how do I become this person.
Well, and I think that, whether you're an actor or not, that's a really valuable experience to put yourself through, because it's almost like, it's really easy to do the right thing if you've never contemplated the darker spirit or side of yourself. And there's the professor of psychology at Toronto. His name's Jordan Peterson. Interesting guy, but he talks about how until you've put yourself in a Nazi shoes or in a dictator's shoes and really tried to see the world through that and recognize, oh, that's something that I could pretty easily become if the circumstances were right. Like, once you've contemplated how far down the dark rabbit hole you can go, only then can you truly choose to be moral and to understand what good is, because it's like the contrast of the two is not only valuable, but maybe even necessary to understand, like, what does it really mean to act with righteousness, or to stand for something that you believe in with courage, or to act benevolently. And I think that, for me, not so much as an actor, but just in the theater of my mind, one of the things that I've done for years in meditation is try to put myself in my enemy's shoes and see how easily I could fall into that role. And it's pretty interesting, the emotions that end up coming up, and how you do start to empathize with your enemy. And that kind of comes into this whole turning the other cheek type thing. And it's like, don't respond in aggression towards someone, but instead, take a breath and at least try to empathize with why they think they're right, even though they, by the standards of the world, they might be totally in the wrong. There's something in the way that they're seeing reality that makes them think that what they're doing is right or necessary. When you're writing, is the process similar as like that? That's a really interesting experience of like having to go out with an actual weapon and, pretend to be murdering humans. Like that's really getting in touch with your darker side. Have you ever had to write a dark role like that? And is the process any different?
I haven't written anything dark for myself necessarily, but I have like a really dark sense of humor that I feel like is maybe at odds with who I am, who I say I want to be a little bit. You know, like if I really broke down, I went through this group thing. It was like where you kind of break down, like, what do you want your life to be about, and what do people take away from you? And for me, it was like, I want people to have a sense of hope when they take away with me. And it's like, for me, it was like, what is a sense of sarcasm that I generally approach people with? How does that impact that? Oh, probably not how I want that to, you're totally kind of hypocrite to what you would say is like the most important thing of what you want people to take away. And so I really, that was a really big paradigm shift for me. But I've only really written 2 short films, and one I've made, which is where the first one I put my son in a dog suit, and it's like this weird comedy about the frustrations but in marriage and how, all that comes apart. And he's kind of this dog boy, synonymous with like children and pets, and is based on this couple that I knew that I felt like maybe loved their dog more than was maybe people should love a dog. I know that could be controversial in some circles. And then the other one's like a father and son. I'm actually making a deer for it right now. Hit a deer, and the father decides to show the son how to be a man, and they need to put this deer out of its misery. And it's a dark comedy, and it's kind of how kids take messages that you try to teach them and totally run them back at you in ways that you're like, no, not like that, But so I don't know that either of those really go with empathy, but like that's kind of what I've been drawn to from my writing side of kind of my inspiration, which is kind of more of a weird, probably people might hate to use his name, but Louie CK-ish, kind of thing, which I really respect him despite I think, there's obviously some flaws that have come out, but I think his sense of humor and his directness is something that resonates with me. And part of that's because it's just such a brutal honesty in some ways, but it's also really dark. And I'm like, I don't know that I want to go to that dark place too sometimes.
Yeah. So. Well, and I think, for me, that's the interesting part about Louie CK is that he really, he wasn't just pretending to be coming from a dark place. He was coming from a very dark place and wrestling with some demons, I think, in his life, obviously. And, my brother and I were talking about this and talking about, well, how do we properly process, like, a lot of the stuff that's coming to light in the news? And it's one of those things where it's like you kind of have to say, well, he's a really great comedian and he's struggling with some really dark things. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Like, people can be multifaceted and multidimensional, I think, and we can have empathy and maybe hold the space for someone to transform into the better version of themselves, because at least the sense that I get from working with people who are wrestling with their own personal demons, and maybe actually demons, we could talk about that. But, one just showed up. But I really think that, rather than judging someone for their demons, like holding the space for them to have a transformational experience can be really powerful. And I wonder what that would look like on a more macro level if more of us were doing that. I know that you have been heavily involved in different ministries, and I'd be curious to understand kind of when you guys are doing outreach to people who maybe have a different ideological stance than you, what does it look like to hold space for that person, and have you seen transformation happen? And do you think that's something that we can apply to the rest of the world, as we're kind of in this like moral and conscious growth experience in society right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the most important thing is to listen, which I'm not saying I'm not a hypocrite to that sometimes too, but I think that's kind of my approach, is listening to where people are at. I think what I saw that I realized I was for a while in Christianity, especially, and more of a proselytizing part of that is waiting for you to stop talking so I can tell you my spiel. Which is what most of us are doing, and to actually say, like, where are you at, and how do I how do I meet you where you're at and listen and try to actually care for you as a person instead of being so right. There was a line in a movie that I helped produce called An Ordinary Family, and it's this preacher brother that's struggling with his other brother that's gay.
Mm-hmm.
And the mom asked at one point, do you want to be right or do you want to be in a relationship? And I think that line is really good just across the board for people who are struggling with differences in anything. It's like, are you going to excommunicate people because you think you're right, which you may or may not be? Do you really want to be in a relationship? Because we're not going to agree on everything. But I think part of it's just how can I love people? Like when I know I'm going to have a hard conversation with somebody, which can be Christian or non-Christian, whatever. It's like, how do I come at this in love? Where it's not about me being right. It's not about me trying to convert. It's how do I meet you and love you? Because I think when we love people, that's where we have a chance to actually have progress. And that's progress for me, and that's progress for that person, because they're experiencing, I think we gain when we love people, and when we experience love from people, and when we love people, and so ourselves. And so that's ideally what I try to do.
Yeah. Easier said than done.
So
sometimes.
it is, I feel the hypocrisy in me, and I've had to dive away from a lot of social media because it's just making me so angry. And I think that was infecting how I interacted with my wife and my kids, and, I don't want to have a shorter fuse with my kids because I was reading what people were saying on Facebook today.
Right.
And I can get really amped up about that. And so, I read something the other day and I'm just like, oh my gosh. It's like, I want to respond, but I'm like, will it go anywhere? Like, I think a year ago I started trying to interact with people and kind of go back and forth. And I had to give up on that because in some ways I was like, I can't help if they go back to their silos of whatever. And then, you'll think you've made some sort of progress, but it feels so fleeting. And I don't know that you can have a real relationship over it. I don't know. I still kind of interact with it a little bit, but I definitely had to dial it back.
Well, it's such an impersonal medium because you're hiding behind a computer. You don't have to look somebody in the eyes. Oftentimes it's just an icon, especially if you're on something like Twitter. You don't even know if it's a real person or some kind of artificial intelligence, bot. And it's so easy to say something snarky or nasty when you don't have to actually look that person in the eye. And that's a big reason for me wanting to do these more long-form conversations is because I was having that same experience on social media where, I was like, I'm gonna say my piece because my side of the story isn't being heard here. And I was really coming from a place of feeling like I was massively misunderstood because I held some viewpoints on reality that went against the grain of kind of what the accepted viewpoint was. And it was really upsetting to me to not see me being represented in some of those conversations. And so I said, I'm going to take it on myself to do this. Well, that was the wrong move because when people are so dug in, I don't get the sense that social media is the place where you're going to be able to have a rational conversation that potentially opens people up to having more empathy towards your viewpoint. However, if I've reached out to those people and said, hey, can we go to coffee and talk? Well, then that's a much different story. And almost always those conversations end in something like, well, let's agree to disagree, but I definitely have a better understanding of your viewpoint now. And I don't feel as angry or as though I'm projecting rage towards that concept because I can see how you arrived at that. But yeah, social media is a dangerous thing, I think, in that it does allow us to hide a little bit from really having to have the experience of understanding someone because you can kind of check in and out of it whenever you want. And you don't if you place a really good zinger like an article to a news thing that just shatters somebody's argument, like it's this super ego inflating thing where you're like, well, I just fucking won that one. But then I was having this immediate experience after that where I felt guilty because I was like, oh, that was so satisfying that clearly like I'm operating from a place of how did this personally benefit me instead of it being a win-win thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just think it's dealing with that anger, which I still have some. Like I said, I read something the other day that was, and it's not an unreasonable, but I think it's seen people be on what I would consider it is unreasonable. I think it's a lack of empathy for either side. Like I said, when people want to definitely dig in, and I want to like let me. It's a little more gray than that, and like think about this side and how do you anyway. But it's just kind of exhausting. But yeah, I mean, I think that's where, because there was definitely a while that I was angry and I was holding that, and I could pray and sit around and talk and come out with a good, well thought response over time. Like, I'm gonna spend a few hours thinking on that one. I think that's the thing where you feel a little bit empowered. Is you're like, okay, let me collect my research and like I'm gonna pull this together. And, okay, I'm gonna delete that. No, that's too much of a zinger. Like I was really trying to respond in a controlled manner because I was like, I felt like if somebody said some of those things to me, I'd just hit him with a ping hammer in person. So maybe it was best I was just on social media. In love, of course. But isn't that what we're all guilty? I'm guilty of the same thing that I'm seeing out there then. I'm seeing something that's, I'm having such a radical response to it. And I think part of that was even like seeing, for me, what I considered destructive views that were coming out of a lot of people with what call themselves like overtly Christian, but some aren't. And feeling like when I'm talking to people about my faith, like having people actually say, well, it just seems like it's kind of evil and stupid, and being like, yeah, it kind of is. I don't have a response to that right now,
Right. Well, because the manifestation of it is so many people practicing a belief system from their own personal ego instead of that place of empathy that I think it's designed to be practiced from.
Yeah.
And, I think for a long time, especially during the election process, I was just like, unfriend, because I didn't want to have to deal with how triggered I was by a lot of the things that I was reading. And I feel terribly guilty about that still. Like, I wish I wouldn't have done that, because I recognize in myself now that, the reason that I was getting so triggered is because I had these kind of pockets of angry energy in my nervous system that needed to be triggered. And one of the more woo-woo practices that I do is I have this little T-ball baseball bat, and anytime something brings up that level of rage or like my blood boiling, I will go out to the trash pile in my yard, and I will just swing that bat, and I will not project my anger at anyone. I will just, for maybe an hour, be swinging that bat at the trash pile and saying, I have so much anger in me. I have so much anger in me. And it's like giving that anger an expression. And then once I've gotten it out, I can go look at the same comment or article or have the same conversation with someone, and I'm not so reactionary to that. It's like on a biological level, something inside of me was being brought to the surface by something that someone said to me, and by releasing that pent-up energy, it somehow allows me to think about things more clear-headedly without being so emotionally attached to the outcome of that conversation. And then I think the interesting thing about prayer, and whatever denomination of prayer you go after, is that I do get the sense that you can ask to have the mantle of spirit put on you, and that will bring its own emotionally cleansing process. And, I'd be curious to hear what your experience with prayer has been like, and how you kind of utilize that in your toolkit. because the depending on which religion you're coming from, or which metaphysical practice, or even which branch or brand of Christianity, I think prayer is viewed in a lot of different ways. And I've been really trying to utilize prayer less as like a voodoo technique of give me what I want, and more as a receiving of clarity. Like, I don't know how I'm supposed to show up here, but I'm looking for the clarity. Can you bestow that on me?
Yeah, I mean, I for me, I generally think that life is about relationship, and so prayer is about relationship and trying to have relationship with God. I think I read this book called Connecting by Larry Crabb years ago, and it kind of revealed to me how I was using prayer as kind of this like, pull the lever and hope it, gives you what you want. Thing, and it's a sense of like trying to use prayer as a sense of control, even though, I think in Christianity they would say, oh, you're giving control of God and you're praying. You're like, well, God, if it's up to you, I'd really like you to make this girlfriend thing work out for me. And I'm just taking it to you. And so now that I've taken it to you, like, make it go nicely, And there's a sense of trying to create some sort of artificial control and establish yourself as God by praying to God, which is kind of a weird, but it's an easy thing to do. It's such an easy thing to do. Because I think so many of us are trying to create control of life, and it's why sometimes it's just I need to go organize my closet because I have no sense of control in life, and that will give me some control, and I could probably purge a few things, and that'll just I like to trim trees.
Yeah,
I like to trim like the dead limbs and trees out.
Yeah,
like, there's just something like it's a prettier tree now. Like I've got a little control. I got rid of the dead branches. Like it's just. It's a little nicer than what I had before. So, yeah, I mean, I think I probably don't pray as much as I used to because I realized how I was using it. I feel like I prayed a lot more, but it was a manipulative sense of how I used prayer.
Yeah.
And there was also probably some disillusionment in that for me, and realizing, who I was and all of that. I think so. I use it to, hopefully encourage relationship between myself and God and myself and other people. Because that's what I think is a huge key in life is pursuing relationship.
Yeah. I think, I've for 15 plus years was really involved in metaphysical practice, and I still am. I mean, I'm interested in everything. Like I like to know the systems and filters that people are using to think about reality. And, so I was raised in the church, and so I learned about prayer from an early level within the Christian church. And then I walked away from the church because of the hypocrisy that I saw there. Like I didn't see any of the things that I felt were important as far as love and empathy actually being put into practice. And I was also a curious teenager who had a ton of questions that were not being properly answered and were actually being brushed under the rug, and I was being disciplined not to ask certain questions. And so I left for a very long time to get answers to some of those questions. And the interesting thing that happened was that I had a really profound experience with prayer from the metaphysical viewpoint, which is where prayer is used, I think, as a control mechanism. It's this idea that you can kind of merge with reality and have this conscious control over reality. And that's absolutely true. I found in those practices that there was a massive amount of control that you could enact over reality. But it also started to there was no more surprise left. Like the mystery of surprise wasn't there. And it was also completely based on my ego desires. I like you were talking about, I was using prayer as this manipulation to get what I wanted instead of maybe what I needed. And so in the past few years, I've really shifted my prayer from being, here's what I want, show me how to get it, to I think I know what I want, and I think my desires are benevolent, but I'm more interested in the truth of how I can best show up and be benevolent to myself and to my family and to my local community and to my state and my nation and my world and the universe at large, if space is even real. I'm kidding. And, I get the sense now, and the way that I'm practicing prayer is more or less me projecting towards some amorphous concept called God, and more me asking to receive whatever I need to receive in any moment. And a lot of times that's clarity on how I need to show up, or clarity on what emotions I need to properly express. And it's been a really good experience for me, shifting from that, how do I get what I want, to how do I understand what truth is? And I'd be curious to hear, if you wrestle at all with the concept of truth or what that means to you, because for many years I was operating from, this filter that said reality is 100% subjective in nature and relational to me, and that I was shifting through billions and billions of dimensions every single second, and reality was catering itself completely to me, which is a pretty egotistical way to look at reality. But also, I think that I was definitely having a tangible experience of that being mirrored back to me. But now I'm exploring that maybe there's some objective truths that house that subjective layer. And so I'm trying to get to the heart of what that kind of, if subjective reality is the river that's flowing, I'm trying to understand what is the bedrock that holds that in place. And I'd be curious how you approach the concept of truth in a fake news world.
Do you have a sense of anything you'd list as truth? Just to kind of help me understand.
Well, I think for me, truth, that's a good question. Something that I would list as truthful is I know when I'm having an experience in my body. So I know when I feel angry that is a feeling that I'm having, but is that the highest, is that the greatest filter understanding that I could have? I'm not sure. I mean, this is what I'm struggling with. I don't think that I do have a good answer to what something that is truthful is, because, especially with the internet, you can convince yourself that anything is true. And that's the problem, I think, politically right now, is that you can get so trapped in your own echo chamber that you believe that all of your ideas about reality are 100% accurate, because you're constantly being reinforced and backed up by articles and things that support whatever it is you want to believe.
I'm going to Google why I'm right now.
Exactly. And, as an organism, I'm really interested in the hive mind of the internet and how that can be used to be really beneficial to society, but also how it can be absolutely detrimental. And more importantly for me, how I've had to say, I don't really know on a lot of things, because I went from a place of having, false security in how right I was about things, to starting to say, okay, well, clearly I'm in an echo chamber, and clearly I'm having some massive cognitive dissonance here. And so learning that anytime I read an article written by this perspective, I need to go read an article written by the complete opposite perspective, no matter how uncomfortable that article is, because that discomfort that I feel when I'm reading a dissenting viewpoint from my own is reality showing me that there's something in my nervous system that needs to be burnt out. Otherwise, I'd be able to hold both viewpoints without emotionally reacting to them, and I'd be able to then operate maybe from a place of higher reason. And so I'm always trying to take the opposite viewpoint of what I believe and use that to burn out the uncomfortable feeling that it brings up in me, so that I can potentially have more access to clarity on what the truth of the situation is. But it's not easy, because you can literally Google any viewpoint and you can find somebody who's like, yeah, that viewpoint's absolutely right. And then they usually have really good reasons why it's right.
The Earth is flat. You know that, John, don't you?
Oh, don't even get me started on that because I was writing a whole book on flat earthers for a while because I was so fascinated with that viewpoint. And the millions of people, they have their own conference now that is all about this deception. And, you know, one of the things that I've found, because I'm a massive conspiracy theorist and always have been, is that when you buy into the idea that there is an Illuminati that is trying to control reality, you can start to believe in a lot of really crazy shit. Yeah. And, you know, I'm always coming from the viewpoint of, well, I don't know if there is a power elite that's trying to control us. And I need to make sure that I maintain that stance of I don't know until I'm 100% clear. Because if you go down that rabbit hole, all of a sudden you can start to take on a whole slew of belief systems that don't necessarily serve you in that moment, because you're buying into this idea that something's being hidden from you.
Yeah, I mean, the whole of confirmation bias, like you're finding things and like it all supports that view.
Right.
And, you know, I was recently asked by somebody that I care about, like, so what do you think about the shadow government stuff? You know? And I think once you buy into like, oh, there's a shadow government that controls it all in the same way, or Illuminati or anything like you're saying, like, that kind of gets us where we are. And I feel like that had seeped into our culture to a degree that even like I had been like, yeah, you know, maybe, probably, you know, and I think even now there's like disappointment that I hadn't done more to like really sit down and address some of that. And part of it's because it's something you can't really prove exactly 100% or not. And
that's why it's so controversial.
Yeah. And so even I was working on a movie about a reporter who was found in a bathtub with both of his wrists slit and was kind of investigating the ties, Danny Castellero, between like the U.S. government and some crime and stuff. And so it's like, oh, is this giant, web of it all? Or is it just kind of like the people that are willing to do evil shit kind of end up working together?
Right.
You know? And so it's like, oh, the reason this guy kind of ties to that is because, well, they got to find somebody that's a little questionable that's willing to do this thing. And, well, that guy probably also did something for this guy, you know, and how does that all tie in? I mean, that was an interesting thing to kind of go through and try to determine. And I think also just like an understanding that like everything is people trying to advance their own kingdom in a way. The guy working at the IRS, he's trying to get a raise. He's trying to get a promotion. And so he's going to go after people and try to do stuff. The guy working at the, wherever, they're trying to do that. And it's not some great conspiracy to try to take over the world. It's the minion that's working and just trying to climb the ladder and trying to do the best for him and his family that's working in those entities. And everything is seeking to grow. You know, you're either growing or you're dying. So
yeah, I think
it's kind of the more of the perspective I've taken probably, but
right.
I don't remember what the question is.
Well, I think the inverse that's all just minions that are doing what they're told. Well, the same could be said about Nazis in concentration camps.
Oh, yeah.
They were just minions doing what they were told, and each level of the pyramid isn't aware of the other. And so if you really get into the truth or conspiracy theory movement, it's like, yeah, they likely are minions and they don't have the full picture. They're just doing what they're told to do. But the problem is that they're doing what they're told to do and they're not asking enough questions about what are the motivations behind me being asked to do something. And, there's a Kendrick Lamar song talking about there's levels to it, and I do think that there are. And when it comes to manipulation at a world level, I think it's clear that does exist at certain levels, and it's just a matter of, well, how overarching is it, and who are the players, and is there any way to prove any of it? And if you could prove it, what kind of evidence would be required for the world to actually accept it? Because people don't want to accept dark truths. They don't want to be told that their entire concept of reality has been wrong and that the entire framework that they've used to have some semblance of control has been inaccurate. And so because of that, there's an immediate dismissal anytime you say that anything is a conspiracy between certain groups. there are plenty of conspiracy theories out there that I think are ridiculous. But with all conspiracy theories, what I really like about that community is that they force you to ask, are my current beliefs about reality accurate? And so you're at least questioning that. And I think that I went from being, this adamant conspiracy theorist, the moon landing's fake, the earth is flat, just buying into all of it because it's so fun to think that you have the information that nobody else has and that everybody else is this dumb person who just doesn't get it. There's a sense of power that comes in that stance of, I've got hidden information that you don't have.
One of my favorite examples of that is the description of God as an elephant with all the blind people. And it's like, this guy thinks it's this thing. He thinks it's like a tail. This guy thinks it's like a thing. This guy, but I see the full elephant. Like the hubris to use that example, which is so often used, just drives. It's one of my little pet peeves. It's like, oh, you think this and you think that, but I know.
Right.
And that's where we tend to go. Like, I think as people, that's what we've got to fight against which I think we both try to do, but it's hard not to give into that.
Right. Well, and anytime you're saying, I know for certain anything, that's a really dangerous place to be operating from. And, it's one of the interesting things about religion is that, I get the sense that in order to properly have faith, you kind of have to say, this is accurate, this is truthful, even though I can't prove it. What's your take on faith and what that means?
I mean, faith I've always heard traditionally described as hope in things unseen. So it has to go beyond. There has to be a leap beyond everything that I just know. And I think also it took me a while to realize that faith doesn't move in this linear way of I think for a long time, I thought I would just grow and have more and more faith and more faith. And the first time I had a real dip in faith or, question things that was really jarring to me, to experience that. And so I think in some ways I've learned that kind of faith has to be questioned, but, I think faith, you can't totally prove it. And so I think by nature, or it wouldn't be faith, and I mean, but you try to have some sort of reasonable sense of what that is, so that you're choosing to believe. But I think you have to be willing to change too. I think that's an important thing. I think that's, and I think so, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I mean, I think faith is more fluid because you can't always have the same amount of faith. And sometimes that it depends on the experiences and how you're experiencing the world. And I think I don't trust people that tell me, I just always got faith. You just need more faith. And I'm like, I don't think you've sat down and thought about things enough.
Well, so. For me, in the metaphysical world, when you're, so there's a concept in metaphysics called the law of attraction, and it's kind of where this idea that reality is a mirror, and it's showcasing to you your own thoughts, ideas, energy, emotions. There's a bunch of different interpretations of what that mirror is and how it's showcasing. But, the trap of subjective reality is that whatever you have faith in and whatever your expectation of reality is and whatever you really, really want to see, oftentimes I think reality will start to show you information and render itself in a way where you are being confirmed of what you're believing and what you're expecting in that moment. And that's the experience that I was having, because I went really deep into practicing subjective reality and having kind of conscious control. And it was like, if you could do these energy practices properly and build your crystal grids and your mandalas properly, you would draw in the people and energy that were a match to those concepts. And then you would have this experience of, this must be truth because reality is showing it to me. But then what I started doing is saying, well, let me try, some different practices, and see what happens. And then I would get confirmation of those practices as well. And as I moved through all of these different metaphysical and religious practices, I was having this experience that reality was going to confirm whatever my conviction was in the moment. And so how is it possible for me to actually understand what is truthful? Even when I was researching the flat earth for this book that I was writing, because I was so interested in how the hive mind could be that detrimental, I got to the point where I went too deep into flat earth and I was like, well, clearly I'm too stupid to know because I didn't understand enough about astrophysics and also, like, I really like to believe in a conspiracy theory. So I was letting myself kind of go with it because I like to put myself in. I was like, wow, how interesting. Like, this person is putting their entire reputation on the line saying that the earth is flat. Like, that's a really interesting thing.
So is the take on that, like, Magellan was like a hoax? Like, where do they go with, like, sailing around the earth?
Well, it's
How
just
do they
like
deal with that?
The flat earth is like a dinner plate. You can still go around it in a circle. Antarctica is the ice bowl, and the entire earth exists in this. So south is always towards the edge of the plates. And to circumnavigate the world, you just go in a circle around the dinner plate. But, their big thing is that the world has never been circumnavigated north to south, only east to west. You can go so deep into flat earth that it can become really... I suggest everybody does it because it's super interesting to hear how passionate these people are about this concept. But two... I had to be like, well, I'm an idiot, clearly, because I wouldn't know enough to be able to convince somebody who's a hardcore flat earther that it's not. And, I've watched hundreds of debates where people try to do it, and you're like, yeah, well, I kind of believe the flat earther guy was more passionate. They had a better story, and, for years I've always thought that reality was a realm anyway. Like it wasn't tangible. It was more subjective and energetic in nature. And so, I'm not saying that I believe that the earth is flat, but I'm also saying that I'm not smart enough to prove it isn't. And I think that that's one of the things that conspiracy theorists immediately throw out. Not all of them, but a lot of them, especially in the flat earth community, is a complete distrust for anything that they can't observe themselves. And that can be really detrimental, especially as we move into a society that's becoming more and more specialized, and we're relying on the opinions of specialists in order to advance society and to advance technology. You're never going to be able to prove and observe everything yourself. So at some point, you have to take a leap of faith and determine what type of information are you going to trust. And there's a complete distrust of science in general, or at least mainstream science in the flat earth community, and in a lot of conspiracies, because I do think that what happens when you're dealing with people in academia is that they are so entangled with their own concepts that, if you've published 40 papers on a particular phenomena in science and all of a sudden there's new information that says all 40 of those papers might be wrong, well, you're a tenured professor and you really don't necessarily want to have to start over from scratch. And so I think there is a phenomena that happens where they're just like, I'm going to overlook that new information. And then you have these younger scientists and a lot of, like, a really interesting alternative to Newtonian and Einsteinian physics is this model called the electric universe model, and it's a much more simple way of explaining. These are actual scientists and professors who believe that explaining reality through the lens of dielectricity and magnetism is a more elegant way to explain it, but it's completely rejected by mainstream science. Because it doesn't match the elephant that's been hauled along all these years. And because of that, maybe we're not advancing as quickly because we're not. I think that it's good to accept certain ideas and build on those. Like, you always want to be building on the shoulders of giants, because that's a certain amount of leverage that you can use. So you're not having to prove all of physics yourself. But at the same time, I do think that historically, the contrarian viewpoint is usually the viewpoint that ends up opening a whole new framework of or paradigm of reality. And so to completely reject those contrarian viewpoints, I think is a mistake. So yeah, that's a long tangent on, what is truth and how do you prove it to yourself? And I think the point that I got to was, well, the shape of the world doesn't really matter to me, because it's a humbling experience to know that, we live in such a complex system that maybe I'm not going to have a tangible experience of knowing everything. And it comes back to that sense of control, like needing to know how everything works is you needing to control things. And it's like there's this level of faith that you can have in God, or this kind of benevolent, amorphous idea of reality, but then there's also faith that you have that the coffee pot is going to work the way it is, and you don't necessarily have to. You're going to get in your car and you trust that the engineers built it the right way, and that the right checks and balances were in place, so that all you have to do is put it in drive and hit the gas pedal. You don't have to understand the physics of combustion. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what truth is, but I know that for me, that is my greatest question right now. And the more that I ask that question, the more that it feels like a humility comes over me where it's okay to not know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that strikes me is kind of where I got to a point in my faith with Christianity, where I was like, for me, it boils down to like, who was Jesus? And it's like, and what did he say? He said, like, love God and love others, as you love yourself. And that assumes, of course, that you love yourself and you're not this totally self-loathing person. Yeah. I think, and so one, learning to love myself, and then learning to love people like I love myself, and loving God. But I think that's also, if you can distill things down to that simplicity, like the simplicity, you're kind of distilling, like, what is important and where does it all need to flow out of? And for me, that was like a basic tenet that kind of impacted how I interact with people, instead of, like, once again, trying to be right. Like, oh, let's sit down and argue about flat Earth all day. And it's like, at the end of the day, what does it really matter? Other than, I mean, I would say there's a degradation of intellect happening maybe there. That's maybe something to worry about.
Well, I think it's also a good testament to the subjective nature of information, because, again, I'm not saying that I believe the Earth is flat, but I am very interested in people who think that, and I'm interested in their ideas because they're able to convince themselves, and I think they have some arguments that showcase how we're not being taught, physics and astronomy the way that maybe we should, because there are so many unanswered questions. And I think the reason I'm drawn to that community and interested is because it's the same experience I had in Christianity, where I had so many unanswered questions, and I was like, well, if these questions can't be properly answered, and if I'm just being laughed off the stage, why do I want to be a part of this? Like, shouldn't my questions have answers to them? And I think that there is something happening in our schooling system where we're only teaching to standardized tests, and a lot of students have questions or curiosities that maybe aren't being satisfied, and then because of that, maybe they don't want to go into a formal, collegiate experience or even be involved in academia, because academia is this kind of nepotistic thing where it's really hard to have a new idea in academia. Like you have to be supporting the ideas that already exist there. And yeah, I get the sense that we need to do a better job of answering people's curiosities, and that maybe information is subjective in nature. And there's no doubt that the current model of science that we have, we've been able to build all kinds of magnificent technologies on it. But does that mean that that's the only interpretation of the only mathematical interpretation of reality? it would seem to me that those interpretations can always be refining themselves. And with models like the electric universe, it's like, okay, well, here's maybe a more refined way to get to the same answers. You know, we're not saying that the answers that we have are wrong. We're saying that maybe, and I say I'm talking about alternative theories. These alternative theories are saying maybe those answers are right, but maybe there's a simpler way to get to those. And by understanding this more simple path, maybe we could expand our knowledge even greater. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think I grew up naturally wanting to question things. You know, I think I question if it's something that we can share with other people, that can you really convert people to question things? Like, I mean, I grew up in my dad always likes to tell a story. It's like Richard would argue with a fence post, you know? I remember Tom, he's a Little League, first time he got a strike, he looked back at that ump like, seriously, that's a strike? like I've been that kid.
Yeah.
And that person. And I think, you know, as somebody that's interested in trying to shift paradigms and the values, trying to think critically about things, how do I get people to question that, you know? And is that through some of the art that I'm creating? Is that through my relationships? And then how do I continue to do that? Because I definitely can fall in those same silos and, you know, realize it's something that I believe just because I heard somebody say it and kind of adopted that or accepted that as a truth. And then it's like, oh, at some point, if I really dig down, ooh, what if that's not true? And then what does that mean?
Yeah.
But I don't know that everybody has that curiosity. And can we foster that curiosity? Like right now, I've got my kids in a Montessori, and I feel like part of that, the reason that's exciting for me is because it fosters a curiosity and for them to ask questions and isn't just teaching them, you know, learn this, learn that, learn this for standardized testing. It's saying, hey, what are you interested in? How do we kind of focus you on that? No, what are you weak in? Like, oh, let's work with you on that, you know, and kind of from that kind of mindset and education. And for me, that's more valuable than trying to learn Latin, you know, or, you know, just, I mean, if you try to think through like, oh, how do I educate, you know, I mean, especially I grew up in like a small town. So my parents were like, you're going to Jordan and Lit, you know, and here in Austin, there's so many things and I'm able to send my kids probably where I want to send them. And so what is the best choice and how am I doing that? And that's like this weird weight of like opportunity there. But like, I think I'm trying to foster that in my kids. Like I want them to, which I mean, they question me on everything. So I think we're fine.
They're just like you. They're looking back at the umpire.
Everything's up for negotiation, Dad. It's all negotiable. I'm like, who taught you this?
Well, and what I love about the Montessori system, because I've worked a lot with Montessori schools when I was at Google, and now with the American Honeybee Protection Agency, we have some hives at different Montessori schools. And one of the things that I love about Montessori is that kind of tactile approach to learning. You know, it's really giving people a hands-on experience so that they can understand what they like and what they're excited about, and then teaching through the lens of that excitement. And I really think that one of the things that's interesting about conspiracy theories and people that are really into that whole truther movement is that whether those conspiracies are right or wrong, it creates some level of excitement and passion that makes people want to research things that otherwise they never would. And I see a lot of people who go in believing one thing, and these are the more level-headed people, who go in believing that a conspiracy theory is 100% accurate, and then they come out the other end having a much greater knowledge of how inaccurate it is, because that kind of excitement to know the unknown created the framework for them to do the proper research and to have a more tangible learning experience. And you know, that's one of the things that I felt like when I was in school, and the reason that I didn't pursue greater education than I had was that I would always ask my teachers, what's the practical application of this? Like, how am I going to be using this in the real world? Because if I can't understand how I'm supposed to use it in the real world, what's the point? And I had some teachers that were really good at showcasing to me how this could be used in my own personal life, and I would excel in those courses. And then I had other, like when I took AP Calculus, like my teacher was so bad at telling me how I was going to utilize this method of mathematics in the real world. And so I just was never interested. I would never even go to the class because I couldn't connect it to something that was important to me. And one of the interesting things that I think happens in art and film is that you get this really unique experience or this really unique opportunity to convey a slice of life or to convey information through a lens of reality that someone might be more willing to grasp. You know, I'd be curious to hear, you know, some of your more favorite films and maybe philosophically or what they inspired within you, because I know for me one of my favorite things to do is watch a film that is highly inspirational, that has a great soundtrack, that has a message of hope, and then use that as a momentum to then go out and do something in my own life.
There's a few. I mean, talking about good soundtracks, I love Last of the Mohicans. That's like such a good.
I used to just run all day long to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so I still have it in like my Pandora mix. It's like it'll pop up and you're just like, yeah. And I also I'm a big fan of The Constant Gardener. Have you seen that movie?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's kind of this guy's spiritual journey and going through, and it doesn't end well for, you know, like it's a struggle, but it was a struggle worth taking. And I think there's something special in that. And also it connected with like, maybe I should go be a doctor in Africa and like try to help out, you know, like a movie like that really shifts or inspires and makes me think about, I mean, I didn't do that. I think I always wonder like, oh, when I was really inspired and I really like it, and then I didn't go through med school, I would then be like, well, then I'd have to go to med school, and that's like, what, 10 more years. And I don't know that I really want to, you know, but like something that made me shift and think there's a movie called Holy Motors. That's really good.
It's a really weird movie, right?
It is. It's really weird.
Yeah, I think I've seen it.
But like,
tell us about it.
Kind of a journey of this guy that you're trying to figure out, like, is he God? What's going on? But there's like all these different emotional things. And part of it's just like, it's a amazing piece of acting by the lead actor in it, whose name I can't think of right now, but he's amazing. And just the visuals and thinking through that and like, oh, how do I respond to that, and what is happening, and just the right amount of like mystery that's happening there. I just think there's a short film too. There's by a British guy that I really responded to, and it deals with like how we teach our sons about violence, which is kind of a little taste of what. But it's like this kid that's getting bullied by these other people, and the father keeps telling him, you need to stand up for yourself, you know, blah, blah, you know. It's a whole kind of movie, and then it shakes out. And at the end, like that group of thug kids shows up at the door, and the father goes out, and they start beating up on the father. And the son comes out and just beats the shit out of all those kids with like a board. And the father's, it's kind of this horror, and it's also like, what are you teaching your kids? Like how there's like a hypocrisy in that. Also, I'm uncomfortable with what I feel right now. Like those kids kind of had it coming. Also, he's a hero, but is that really what you want to do? Like films that make me uncomfortable, I really enjoy. I really enjoyed Swiss Army Man. Have you seen that one? Oh my gosh. Have you seen An Interesting Ball, their short film? Oh my gosh. That's the first one I saw. You got to watch Interesting Ball at some point. But it's a short film they did that basically got them into like the Sundance Lab and made that. But I mean, I think Swiss Army Man, like it deals with all these things with like relationships and like this totally absurdist thing. And I think I like absurd humor and fantastical realism a little bit.
Yeah, well,
anyway, all those things.
I like anything that forces me to question the nature of reality. I mean, that's been my jam for 15 years now. It is like, what is reality, and what is my place in it, and why am I even here, and why is anything important at all? And so what to me good filmmaking is helping me understand the perspective of the filmmaker's stance on reality and kind of how they're seeing things, and opening me up to a more emotional experience of the way they see things. Because I think it can be really easy, and a lot of people are wired in a way where they just want to read reports or blog posts or more linear mental concepts about reality. And I'm definitely one of those people who love to read a good theoretical account of what reality is. But at the same time, I feel like I get much more when a great filmmaker or artist presents reality in a way that gives me an emotional experience of the way they're seeing things, because that to me feels much more transformative. And one of the things that I have been working with myself and in the coaching that I do is kind of the difference between this mental dimension and what I call our emotional quantum network. And it's like, if you compare your body to a computer, your brain is kind of this hard drive that's happening, and your heart and your emotional nervous system is more like connecting into the internet, or maybe even like quantum computing. There's so much more processing power available in your body than in your mind, I think, or this is a concept that I'm experimenting with. So I'm constantly asking myself, where do I feel this experience in my body? And as an actor, that's one of the things that I did as well, is like, where would this character be feeling this in their body? And how would it be lighting up their nervous system? And I get the sense that if we're going to have a transformative or transformational experience as a society, that it's easier to do that by inspiring people with catalyst events, so that could be actual reality events or art or filmmaking, than it is to try to mentally convert someone to a new vantage point. Because, one of the interesting things about Christianity to me is there are amazing outreach programs, where missionaries are going into communities that, know nothing about the Bible or about Jesus or Christ or any of those teachings, and they're presenting new ideas to them. But at least I think from the accounts of missionaries who are having a lot of success, it's much less about indoctrinating them with the teachings and much more about, at least initially, just showcasing what empathy and love looks like, and showcasing what it looks like to build a really strong community. And I'd be interested, because I know that you've been, as we talked about a little bit, involved with some various ministries. I'd be curious to hear, like, how you guys, when you're going into a place that you're maybe ministering to for the first time, what does that look like, and like, what is the approach?
I mean, the closest I can think, my wife is on the board of a group called Mobile Loaves and Fishes,
mm-hmm.
and we've been involved with Community First, which is like a ministry to the homeless.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's going into that place and not showing judgment and loving people, like we were talking about. Which, you look at that, it's a community that feels so much judgment, feels such a loss of dignity and personhood. And so how do you try to give that back to people? How do you love them? And sometimes, I mean, I'm probably more haphazard with that than my wife is, like, amazing. Like, she's organized, and she would rule the world if we would let her. But like a hair in my mouth or something. I don't know what's going on.
Were you licking a cat?
We don't have a cat, John. I don't let my kids have pets because I'm a bad dad. I'm so sorry, children. No, so I mean, I think, and I'm not like on some sort of like, I'm not going into like indigenous villages or something like that. I feel like the way how you're describing it, but like, I mean, I feel like I try to go into places, and I think I'm interested in the artistic community and the actors and people, because I think there is an openness, there is to talk really about things. Because I think even in outside of the church and in the church, there are people that don't want to talk about how things really are. They want to give you platitudes. And And so, you're trying to break down those walls on both sides. It's not just on like, oh yeah, once this person like thinks they're a Christian, whatever. I don't know. But I think so. I mean, I think it's the same across the board. And I've struggled with that some. Like sometimes I want to be like, so, like when they're like, hey, I just need like 50 cents for the bus. And I'm like, I know they're going to spend it on like, and sometimes it's like, you just give them some money or whatever. I give out bus passes. That's the thing I do a lot in the summer so they can get on a bus and be in some AC for a bit. And, but it's like, to learn to just ask their name and talk to them. And, if you feel like they're giving you a fake name, don't necessarily try to dig down and be like, hey, I know it's, like, which is hard for me because I want to get to like where people really are in some ways. And so I think learning that level of how do I determine where, is that coming from a place of love or let me show you that I've figured out your little scam,
Yeah.
And so I don't always have like, oh, it's always like this. Like, I think sometimes that can change based on the person and how I'm interacting with them. And sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But I think, at the end of the day, it's like, how do I sit down and, so it feels weird to like talk about, oh, here's an example of how I was being super cool, man. So I don't,
well, and maybe ministry at a massive level isn't what I'm talking about. Maybe it's ministry one-on-one, kind of like what you're talking about. And for me, what that looks like is, I really believe that reality is going to draw to me the people that I am ready to minister to, or that will find value from my testimony. And so in my own life, what that looks like is people come into my sphere of influence and I really try to listen and I really try to say, what is this person here to teach me? I used to always come from it in latter years, what do I need to teach this person? And instead I've shifted that and said, okay, clearly this person is in my life to teach me something about myself or about reality. Let me see if I can understand that lesson with enough clarity. And a lot of times what that is me allowing that person or reality to properly trigger my emotional system, because they'll say or do something that reminds me of something from my past, and then that makes me feel uncomfortable. And I'm really starting to recognize that discomfort as an opportunity to burn something out of the way that the neurons and electrodes in my system are firing, so that I can kind of partition my hard drive in a way that makes me potentially more empathetic in the future. And I get the sense that when I refuse to feel those things and kind of try to go, out of body or mind over matter and be like, don't judge them. When I don't feel what is being inspired in me, that's usually when reality goes a little bit haywire for me, or that person reacts to me in a way where they think that I'm judging them. But if I can really feel the discomfort inside of me that is being inspired, then usually the appropriate way, or at least a more clear way of showing up to that person, will present itself, and it'll be this beautiful experience where we're sharing information both at an energetic and existential level, but also at a mental level of conversation and language that serves both of us. And I don't know, I guess when I shifted into that stance of reality being the greatest teacher, I felt like I started having more beautiful experiences than when I thought I knew everything and was trying to be like, well, you should listen to me because I've read a lot of books. And I think that depending on the brand of Christianity or the type of church that you go to, one of the reasons that so many people are standoffish with Christianity, in my experience, is because there are versions of Christianity that are all about, you're here so that I can teach you. And then there are other brands of Christianity that I think are much more subtle and beautiful, that are all about, look, we want to embrace you, and we want you to inspire what we need to learn about our own community. And maybe that's where, empathy becomes more of a glue than knowledge. How is your church structured, or how do you guys go about interacting with one another? I mean, is it...
I don't actually go to a church very consistently at all right now.
Okay.
Very sporadically have gone out to the Community First Church.
Mm-hmm.
I've also been a little bit with the Gateway Church, and then another friend. And I think for me also, church boils down to it means people, and that's kind of been lost in the Western civilization culture to a large degree. It's like, oh, you need to have church, and it's like, well. And if you go back and study what that meant, it meant people and a real relationships with people, and not some building that we all go to and get talked to and, feel good about ourselves for an hour. And then okay, I checked it off. Did that for my week. So I think my perception of what church has evolved. I think it's possible I'm also just lazier on that. But, I think part of that is also... the amount of time my wife and I have with kids, it feels like it can be more giving and more loving to them sometimes not to go to church, especially for a while when they were having total breakdown. We'd go to church, kids would break down, one of us would have to leave, and it's like, what are we doing here? So that changed, honestly, since my second kid was born, we've been super sporadic with actually attending church. And, I think a lot of that comes down, I think a lot of what we communicate to them comes down to what we're communicating to them in the home, and that they're seeing it lived out.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that go to church every Sunday, and it's like, yeah, the dad called the wife a bitch right before they rolled in, you know? And so, so it's so trying to work on relationships and trying to have that balance. I don't know that we're balanced. I wouldn't say we're the way to do it. I would say I would totally have judged the way I'm living my life 10 years ago. I was like, why can't people just get to church, man? What's the deal? You need to prioritize. And now I'm like, I don't know.
Well, and it's only, for me, because I haven't gone to church since I was, 16. And the reason is because I always felt it should be a personal relationship that I'm having with whatever God is. I want to have a personal relationship. And, one of the things that I feel we've moved away from in the last couple of centuries is this idea that someone pious has to be the bridge between you and God. And that was kind of the premise of the priesthood, was that, here was somebody who was chaste and pious and could build that bridge to the heavens for you. And, I certainly disagree with that. I believe that it is a very personal and intimate thing, and your relationship with God is going to mean one thing to you and something completely different to another person. And I do agree that enacting that in the world is more important than going to a church. And I've been talking a lot about something I call the utopia trap, which is where you surround yourself with people who share the exact same beliefs about the world as you, and you all go to the same building and you all practice the same things. And anytime you go out during the week, you're only going with people that are from this bubble. And so it's really easy to convince yourself, well, I'm a really good person because my life's going really well. But the second that you go and interact with somebody who isn't a part of that bubble, there's massive conflict. And I've been calling, the intention that I have for interacting with reality, learning to walk through lions' dens, because I'm not interested in learning how to perfectly live in a bubble. I'm interested in how can I move from experience to experience, group to group, and still have a satisfying experience and still minister in the right way and still share my testimony, whatever that is, because it's always in constant flux. And, I don't know that going to church is necessarily the greatest context of having a relationship with God. Sometimes I think it can be used as a crutch so that you don't have to do the deeper work, which is the more personal work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possibly true. I think, it's for either of us to say, like, oh, this is the way to do it, like, which is where you get so many schisms in the church. It's so funny. You go to a more liberal church and they're judging the people that are more straight-laced.
Yeah.
And you go to the straight-laced church and they're like, that liberal church, they don't got it, and it's like, wow, the same narrative.
Why do they have to have that accent?
Why do yeah, sorry. There's some judgment in there, wasn't there? It's just easier to do this voice when you're doing somebody judgmental. But yeah, so I mean, I think it can exist kind of across the board. And there's the danger is me getting to a place where I'm like, the way I'm doing it, John, is the way it should be done. Let me tell you how I see the elephant.
Yeah. And that's a huge trap, and it's one that I was vividly inside of and encapsulated within this idea that I'm doing it right. I've done more research than you. I've delved into all of the ancient religions and philosophy, so you only looking at your Bible are doing it wrong because I have a much more expansive context for how all of that was positioned into history. And I realized, well, I'm totally full of shit. I'm just reading stuff that is interesting to me and glazing over anything that feels uncomfortable, which is why I've been trying to force myself to do the more uncomfortable work and finding that to be more satisfying. And it's like going to the gym. Like, going to the gym and really doing a hard workout is uncomfortable. Like, you don't want to do it, but the benefits of it are so great that once you train yourself in that full process, you keep doing it because you understand that sacrifice now leads to some future opportunity that is better than if you didn't sacrifice. And that's what I'm trying to make my walk with God, and as I kind of come into my own language for describing that. And, it has been interesting to have a lot of different frameworks, but it's also been interesting to see how often I've thought, oh, well, I've got it all figured out. And then to 6 months later be like, I'm an idiot. And I've had that experience enough now where I feel like I'm coming from a place that is more filled with humility, or at least I'm aware of I should be humble in this moment, and maybe I can work more towards that. But I think that everybody has an idea of what is going to give them existential satisfaction. And it's like, for some people it's going to church, for some people it's meditating, for some people it's swinging under a tree or doing a 5K. For some people it's going to some fictitious world full of artificial intelligence robots, which is kind of the interesting premise of the HBO series Westworld. Is you have all of these latent desires with you, or maybe society as a whole has these latent desires that are being unexpressed, and that's what leads to depression, and that's what leads to like this existential funk that people has, is they're not properly dealing with those latent desires and those latent emotional programs. And so, I like Westworld because it's like, what happens if you were able to fully express all of your deepest, darkest desires? What would you learn about yourself? And I don't know that expressing them is the right way to go about it, but with artificial intelligence and with virtual reality, more and more people are able to have this experience of living out some of their darker fantasies without having the physical consequences. And I think that creates a real moral quandary, in that, I can't remember the verse in the Bible, but a lot of metaphysical practices talk about how, if you're thinking it in your head, you've already committed the action. And so it's just as bad as if you had done it in person. And so as we come into this kind of virtual world, it's like, well, even though it's a virtual world and technically it's not physically hurting something, is there a telepathic projection that is still harmful when you're practicing something that vividly in a mental capacity through some kind of technology? And I know that during South by Southwest, you had this interesting experience of being a part of the South by or SXSWestworld or whatever it was called.
It's South by SXSWestworld.
So tell me a little bit about like what that was and what your role was.
So I mean, it was to promote the HBO show Westworld, but what they did was we created a script in a whole town, and it was like a 440-page script, and all the actors are interacting, and like if nobody came off the train, we'd all interact and do our thing and go through and have a whole story and narratives we were following. But as people, we also had the ability to improv and get off of our scripts and then try to come back to it. So as like an artist, like I'd never done anything like that. Like it was super exciting to have that kind of possibility and to play into that, and also see even how as different people came through, like the best show, because I haven't done a lot of theater, I realized like, but the best shows were going to be ones after the first one, because how I interacted with the first group of people impacted how I interacted with the second group, because they might have questions or thoughts or interactions that I'd be like, oh, I can improve on that with this. But so yeah, I mean, so there was like a saloon, and there, were all kinds of stories and narratives happening, and there's people trying to figure things out and where the gold is.
So let me give some context for people who don't know. Basically, this was a world that was set off about like 15 or 20 miles from Austin.
Yeah,
and
they had to take a bus.
And so if you were attending the South by Southwest Music, Film, and Interactive Festival, you could register to get on one of these buses, and they would outfit you with like gear and guns and stuff, kind of like in the show,
They didn't
right?
give people guns. They gave them either a black or a white hat.
Okay.
We tried to keep the guns down.
Yeah.
But people did try to steal the guns, some people successfully, from people on set.
Huh.
And there was one gun that would go off at one point, and the fear was like that somebody would take that gun. Nobody was able to get that one, but I mean,
so anyhow, these people would come through into this bus thing, and then they'd walk through this room and just like in the show, they'd get onto the train, and then all of a sudden they're a part of this 20 or 30 acre property that is full of all of these actors that are quote unquote artificial intelligence, right?
Yeah, and so we were acting like the robots. I thought people would be worse than they were, honestly. So I was glad, with encouraging people to live without limits and bringing them in. And South by Southwest is a place people go to drink a lot of times. I was like, so we're going to have people inebriated, and then we're going to put a black hat on them, and what are they going to do? And so people, people did some goofy things, or people were a-holes or whatever at times, but it wasn't what I feared it might be. Like, I thought it could really spiral, had that opportunity. Just because if you've watched the show, like,
right,
people do horrendous things in that. It's like, well, that's
the whole
what's in my brain,
like,
and then
I'm gonna express my deepest, most latent desires.
I've got a black, because a white hat is supposed to be like, you're a good guy, black hat, and they gave out more black hats than white hats.
I'm sure that's true.
And they didn't let people choose, which I thought was interesting, but they kind of put that on you, so it's kind of like, embrace your black hat.
Interesting.
I think one of the more interesting things was there was this hole where you could dig and get treasure at times, and there were like 3 layers of it, and they're like, nobody's gonna get to the 3rd layer, and like in the first hour they'd gotten to the 3rd layer, but people kept digging in that hole when nothing was there, and you would tell them like, I don't think there's anything in there, and they were digging through like new dirt that had never been dug before, and it started off like, I don't know, the size of like a coffee table book hole, and by the end, like, you could fit a horse in it. Like,
wow.
It was a really interesting psychology thing to see, like, people just be convinced. Like, one person would give up, and the other person, like, that guy just didn't have what it took. And he'd grab the shovel, and he'd jump in that hole and just be digging deeper and making it wider. And you're just like, are you realizing you're digging through, like, grass and things? Like, how, what do you think we did here? Like, anyway.
Right. It's like they didn't trust the information. They're like, this is kind of a weird reality. Like, maybe part of the narrative was, no, it's misinformation. Like, I'll be the one person who doesn't fall for that. It's like at Burning Man, there's this place called the Ministry of Misinformation, and it's a bar that you go to where everybody just lies to you the whole time. And like, you have to figure out, like, are they lying? Are they not? And then they'll be done lying. I'm getting all this from a Duncan Trussell story because I haven't actually experienced it, but The premise is, can you figure out what is actually true versus what is a lie? And it's interesting that people were interacting with that. Well,
they definitely had hosts lie to him. There was definitely, like, I know one character who was hilarious, and, his role was to be kind of this a-hole character. Mm-hmm. And he'd be like, you just need to dig a little deeper, And people be like, yeah. And they would trust that guy, Like the guy that had been, like, cussing him out and telling him all, and he'd be like, yeah, you just ain't got what it takes. You got to dig. Like, they'd go to him and ask questions, and he'd just be like, dig deeper. And they'd be like, okay. And somebody else would, some more earnest character be like, doesn't look like there's anything in that hole. And they'd be like, I'm just going to keep digging. Because I think there's also that fear of missing out.
Sure.
Like, what if I'm almost there and I stop digging and the next person gets the thing that's at the bottom of this hole?
Right. And that's huge. And I feel like that FOMO feeling gets pasted on all of reality. And that's the motivation for why people do a lot of things, even things that, are morally suspect. They're willing to take part in something because they'd rather not miss out on the experience that everybody else is having. Tell me a little bit about what your particular character's narrative was and how you were interacting with people.
So my guy, he starts off, and he's a card dealer in the town, and so he had this kind of love interest with this woman, but he was also working for another character, trying to get her into the bar so that guy could see her. So he's like doing that guy's bidding while also having like a love interest in her. So he's kind of betraying her, but trying to get play on both sides of that. And so, and then you have a few other interactions, and then you're also a actual card dealer in the thing. So there was a ton of improv at the table. It was divided into 3 acts. And so my first act is kind of trying to get this girl to go to this bar and be in there, and then having an interaction with that guy who I'm totally afraid of and can intimidate. He was the a-hole that was telling people to dig, and who was amazing. And so, yeah, I mean, mine wasn't a super complex, like, it was like an ancillary narrative throughout the thing, whereas, like, the bigger thing was, like, there was this bank robbery happening, and there was going to be this shootout, and who's going to die, and there's this one group of guys that they're not even hosts, they were people interacting, and you see them get to, like, that was one of their surprises, that 2 of the people in the group are supposed to be, like, real people, not things, and so they actually kill somebody, and so how that kind of goes, and they're like, yeah, we got him, yeah, trying to beat this loop, and kind of deal, which was super cool. But I think part of what made it so cool too as a experience was there were so many textures within the story that was happening that if you just followed somebody around, you'd get a sense of a totally different narrative. And like, oh, this guy, he works in the blacksmith shop, but his girl works, his daughter works kind of in the brothel over there. And how's his interaction with the community, and how's he doing that? And, all those kind of things that kind of played. It was really a cool thing to be a part of, because there was so many cool creative people and talented people that I said the longer it went on, the more honored you felt to be a part of it.
I can see how that would be, because I mean the whole thing, just a monumental undertaking, and to be able to successfully execute it is kudos to all of you guys that were a part of it. I think, has there been conversation about turning this into like a more full-time thing? Because to me, it seems like this really new style of like immersive art. And from what I've read online, the response was overwhelming. And so, I could almost see this as being, a thing where when you go to Six Flags, there's a whole section of the park that's dedicated to these like loop narratives. And was there any talk of
I mean, I'm an actor in it, so they're not including me in too many of the high level talks there at HBO. They're like, Richard, come here. Hey, Fred Blankenbeaker, why don't you? We need to get you in on this conversation. I've seen some articles about their, that being a cool thing that they could offer at some of these theme parks and things, but I mean, obviously, to really build that out would be a whole different thing. I wouldn't be surprised if people try to create that. I think there would be a concern for some of the same things that, I talked about. Like there was a place where these girls were working on like the humanoid bodies in this back thing, and this guy like creeped around the building and like tried to, you know, like outside of the normal confines of what they're supposed to get in there, and like he shows up in there, and the girls are like, "What the fuck?" You know, and like you got to leave, you know, like you can't be in here, like that's creepy.
Yeah.
And so I just think people struggling to, you know, with a show based on zero limits,
right,
to then like be like it's no limits, kind of,
yeah,
you know, is like you got to be kind of reasonable. So I just, you know, in our current litigious culture, I wonder if they could pull that off believably, or you know, or yeah. But I think there was definitely an appetite, and it went off so well. That's been one of the really rewarding things too, is to see how well it was received. Being like, oh, this was like one of the great activations of the 21st century, and maybe the best thing. You know, like people, there are a lot of people's minds kind of blown with that, and it seems like also people were able to open up in ways. Like there were some of the girls at work that talked about conversations they had with guys that like were deep conversations and like really seemed impactful. And I didn't have my character didn't have a ton of those. You know, I feel like more of my improv happened at the card table, and so people are in a bigger group, so that wasn't happening. But like within the saloon setting, like a lot of the characters that worked within there seemed to have, you know, if they could kind of divide off and have a one-on-one conversation, like if they asked a question, people would respond honestly.
Yeah.
Which I find that so, like, you know, just that to create that sense of like, oh, this is a place you can also have no limits on vulnerability, maybe a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's like when you travel, it's so much easier to be spontaneous than when you're in your normal loop of reality. Because there's something freeing about knowing that whatever you do here isn't going to be reflected back to you, or maybe somebody's not going to know. And when you're talking to a stranger, I mean, that's kind of the value of a therapist, is that they're the stranger where you can divulge your darkest secrets and they're never going to come back to haunt you. Like there's not going to be they're not going to lash back at you because you told the wrong person. And one of the things that's interesting to me about, you know, artificial intelligence in general is that one of the utilizations of some of the new AI technology is therapeutic in nature. There's this app called Replica, and it's basically an app that asks you therapy style questions, and you respond to it via text message. And over time, it learns your personality, and it learns some of your quirks, and it's trained to kind of give you this therapeutic release or expression of some of your deeper, darker secrets. And I could really see that, you know, in the future, we all have like our own AI therapist. Do you have a particular stance or any qualms or concerns about the emerging artificial intelligence scene, or like the transhumanism movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything that dehumanizes people and cuts down on our interaction with real people, I have real concerns about. You know, like hearing you say, like, even with a therapist, I think if we're willing to risk disappointing somebody and having those conversations about who we really are, we'd find more freedom and more, and probably a better life, you know, just a full life. But we can't, you know, I'm really scared if I told you all the things I've said and done and thought, what you'd really think about me. And so sometimes I have to take those to a therapist. I mean, if we really did, we wouldn't need a therapist. And so then you take it to another level. Like, well, I don't want to talk to a real person. I want to talk to a robot. Well, then you go deeper into your silo, and do you ever really feel loved by anything real?
Yeah.
And I think if you're not experiencing real love, I think it's to some degree we can love to the capacity that we've experienced love. And I think that's one of the powerful things about Christianity, that's like, I love you for who you are, and I forgive you. You know, like, and no matter what you've done, like, I understand and I get it. You know, like, I think one of the most powerful things about the life of Jesus is when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And for me, that's a sense of he was on the cross and realized what it's like to feel like God has forsaken you. And all of us have felt that way to some way. And I think for a while I felt guilt when I felt that way.
Mm.
But to realize like, oh, that's something that I cannot feel guilt about. Like it's hard to like express something, I mean, or anything, you know, and not feel guilt about it, I think sometimes. And so, yeah, to come to a machine and say like, oh, can you hear let me tell you about all the things I did and like how I, you know, I cussed out my kid today, you know? Oh, it's okay, Richard. I love you. You know, like,
Right.
Where does that really, is it real? It's not even a real thing.
It's almost like if you're not emotionally risking yourself at some point or like putting yourself in a vulnerable position of this person may judge me, can you actually process through that at the deepest levels?
Yeah.
And my sense is that you can't. You get this kind of false relief in the moment maybe, but are you really processing it at those deepest levels? And, you know, can you truly be empathetic or forgiving to someone else if you're unwilling to be that vulnerable with them?
Which I think is some of what we see in social media now too. It's kind of a false intimacy through that.
Yeah.
Where there's people respond, you know, you can put out things and get responses and kind of you can feel some things, but are you really getting that face to face? Like, man, can I just give you a hug? You know, like that. And so I think that's the addiction because it is kind of this, you're putting things out there and you're kind of out there, but there's not the risk. Or maybe it feels like a risk to throw that out there or to process these things. But I think how much better if you had like 3 people that you could talk to that loved you no matter what. And you could take anything to them. And they would take anything to you. Like they'd be willing, like you've both got to have risk. Like you can't model that and be like, hey, John, give me all your stuff. Yeah, well, let me tell you about this one time I crossed a red light. Oh my gosh, it was crazy. There was no blinking. I don't think anybody was really around, but I just want to tell you about the time I ran a red light. And yeah, thanks for sharing, you know, that you murdered that frog in cold blood. I don't know. I don't know.
Right. Well, it's like if it's not emotionally salient for you, then there's not an equal exchange. Like you can't expect to share something that has no emotional value to you and then expect to get something emotionally latent or emotionally powerful from someone else. And it's like the more you give of yourself, the more you end up getting back from others. And that's why, you know, I really try to practice, you know, a level of transparency in my life where, you know, I'm showcasing that I'm a flawed individual, but also that there are a lot of different sides to me. Because another really terrible, detrimental thing about social media is that it's really easy to say, well, that's the Hillary guy in my feed, or that's the Trump guy in my feed, and make them one dimensional, and that's their only thing. Mm-hmm. And then you end up if you ever give yourself even the opportunity to go hang out with them in person, you're like, oh, wow, that's like such a small part of who they are. They're just like, because social media is what it is, like that's the content that they share on Facebook. But in real life, when you hang out with them, there's so many more aspects to them. And it's so much easier to see why that information might be important to them when you're having a full context of what their life is. And, you know, it's one of the reasons why I've really been just trying to sit down and see what are all the different compartments of someone, because I found myself, you know, really just putting one label on each person in my social media thread, and then being like, well, that's the flat Earth guy, you know. What
was my label, John? What was my label?
That's the guy who hates Putin.
Putin hater.
And it's really easy to do that because if you don't talk to somebody on a regular basis and the only interaction you're having with them is on a political article, your mind, because you're so emotionally charged by that particular content, it's really easy to say, well, this guy hates Russia. He just hates all Russians.
Not all of them, John.
Okay. You know, but this was a a terrible experience that I had during the election, where I found myself doing this on a regular basis, is just like putting people into these boxes and completely detaching their humanity from them and making them only the label that I had projected onto them. And then come to find out, when I finally got around to kind of making amends with some of these people and being like, well, maybe let me see if they're still an asshole. They weren't ever an asshole. Like they were sharing something that seemed salient and relevant to their life, and I wasn't taking the time or the opportunity to understand why they held that viewpoint. And then come to find out, like, a lot of those viewpoints, once I understood their perspective and the context, I was like, oh, actually, I think that's something that I want to believe. Maybe I was wrong in my stance. Now, it doesn't happen very often. But I am trying to showcase what it looks like to change your mind on certain subjects. And I think a big part of that is softening your energy on certain subjects, like not being so massively dug in, and being willing to hear someone without letting it trigger you. And it's hard. It's a hard thing to not be triggered when somebody says something that flies in the face of everything that reality to be. But for me, the context that I handle that in is, well, if there's discomfort there, it means that I'm suffering from some kind of cognitive dissonance, because if genius is the ability to hold multiple vantage points at the same time and think about them with reason, then I should be able to hold this guy's stance and this lady's stance and my stance at the same time without feeling my blood start to boil. And that's the only way that I'm going to be able to figure out the amalgamation of these three vantage points and the solution that that can come from those three vantage points.
Do you believe in evil?
Yeah. More and more I do. And part of the reason that I moved away from believing that reality was completely subjective is because, at least from the way that I was starting to practice Eastern philosophy and a lot of the metaphysical practices, was like there was no such thing as good or evil. Like everything was just kind of this oneness. And so to say that something was good or bad was a judgment, and that judgment was then dictating the way reality would render itself to me. But I do get the sense now that there are hierarchies of consciousness. And so, David Hawkins has a scale of consciousness, and it's basically like rating consciousness from 0 to 1,000. And 1,000 is this like super enlightened, benevolent view. And 0 is, let's murder everyone on the planet. Yeah, I'll take some more coffee. And so, in that stance of hierarchy of consciousness, I get the sense that if you're skewing more towards the lower end of that consciousness scale, that could maybe be considered evil. And Jordan Peterson has an interesting way of kind of interpreting. So Jordan Peterson, and I talked about this on the last podcast, but I'll go into it again, talks about kind of the evils of postmodern thinking. And one of those evils is the multiple interpretation theory, where you can interpret any piece of art or anything in reality a million or an infinite number of ways. And so there is no such thing as good or evil. There's just an infinite number of interpretations. And what he's talking about is, yes, that is true. There are an infinite number of interpretations, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of those interpretations are good. And maybe a more appropriate way to think about interpreting reality or scenarios or anything is this benevolent and good for me? And if it's good for me, is it good for my friends and family? And if it's good for my friends and family, is it good for the community as a whole? And if it's good for the community as a whole, is it good for the nation? And if it's good for the nation, is it good for the world? And is it good for the environment? And then is it good for my enemies? And so maybe it's important for us to start thinking about, good and evil, or maybe evil is a concept that is entirely selfish in nature and serves nobody but a very small group of people, or maybe just one person. And maybe absolute benevolence is something that is completely respectful of the most amount of people and serves in a benevolent way the most amount of people. And so that's kind of how I'm trying to interpret good and evil right now. Is evil is very manipulative and agenda driven and designed to raise up a small number of people, or just one person maybe, where good is having absolute respect for everything and anything and allowing people to have their own experience. And, I think this is why God gave us free will, because the ultimate benevolence is to say, I love you so much that I'm going to allow you to make your own mistakes. Even though I know what would be best for you, I'm going to allow you to not do that.
It's like the hardest thing to do as a parent.
Right. Well, I can imagine.
See, I feel like having kids is like one of the greatest like acts of faith you can take, because you have no real control. Like, and what control you think you have is a lot more limited than you think. But yeah, I mean, letting kids make their own decisions on things, you're trying to control them, trying to grow them at first as saplings, but at some point, I think part of me dreads like the teenage years.
Yeah.
And them, because I know they're going to make mistakes. I know they're going to have pain in their life. Like, I don't want that for my kids. I don't want them to experience the pain that I had. But I also realize I have to let them have pain to like grow as people. Anyway, that's a total side off of good.
Yeah.
And evil, but.
Well, I'd be interested to hear what you were like as a teenager, because they always say that, at least my parents were always like, just wait until you're a father, because your kids are going to be even worse than you were. And it's almost like reality serves you with the experiences, whether it's with your kids or your coworkers or whoever, where you can have empathy for maybe some of the more selfish things that you did in your past. And I'm pretty confident that I won't have kids. But what's interesting is that in some of my coworkers and employees, I'm having the exact terrible experience, not terrible, but interesting experience with them that my parents had with me as a teenager, and I was a hellacious teenager. And so when I ask God to give me clarity on like, why am I having these experiences, what keeps coming to me is you're learning to be empathetic to your parents' situation that they were in when they had you and when they were trying to raise you. And I'd be curious to see how you see like a reflection of you as a kid in your own kids and how you kind of deal with that.
I think right now it feels more like I'm trying to be more supportive and encouraging than maybe some of what I got. I was a pretty good rules follower. I questioned things, whatever. But like also like I think of like artistically, I kind of made some mention of it earlier, but like I remember being in the second grade and writing a book about the mouse that stayed up at Christmas, and it wasn't, this whole thing, and my teacher found it and threw it in the trash.
What?
And I mean, this could be controversial. She was Hispanic, she was racist, and she hated all the boys in the class.
Huh.
And so that kind of thing, or, I got paddled for reading too long in the third grade. Public school education was great. Which was part of me being like resistant to like putting up my book, but I was going to finish this story in our literature program, and I got paddled twice for it, because after they paddled me once, I walked back in and was like, well, now I'm going to finish it. And they came back in, and I was like, boom, close the book, and they were like, back out in the hallway. And they paddled me again. My mom saw these bruises all over me when I took a bath that night. Was like, what happened to you?
So you went to a public school that still had corporal punishment.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I think there was a sense, and so I think I see a lot of myself in my son. Like there's like an empathy and a sensitivity, and trying to encourage him and trying to love him. And just also kind of a fearfulness sometimes that I see in my own self. And so trying to encourage him to be brave instead of being like, yeah, don't step out there. Like, life sucks. Grow up and be tougher. Being like, trying to be more encouraging. I'm struggling right now to think of how all that pieces together at the moment. But I think, encouraging him to like jump to me and not letting him go. You know, I think there were people in my life that thought, "Oh, I'm just telling you how tough life is." And I think in my perspective, it's my job isn't to like show him how tough life is. Like the world's gonna do that. The world's coming for him. It's gonna be tough. And instead, try to encourage him and love him in the way that we want to love people. And I think there's a danger in going too far in either way on that, obviously. And, you know, I'm not thoroughly convinced that I'm always doing the best job. But, you know, I think in some ways he's become really, he's not, you know, he's become more brave in things than he naturally had a proclivity to.
Yeah.
My daughter, on the other hand, like, is brave. Usually she was brave for a long time with no reason to be brave. Like she would like jump off things and just have total faith I was going to catch her at all times. I remember there was this one time I was talking to Gideon and Greta jumped off the bed and I just wasn't looking at her. I just see her just go whoop out of the corner of my eye and like bam on the floor.
No.
And that was like but there were so many times before that I caught her like by the ankle. Like she would have jumped off a chair and just be like, somebody's going to catch me.
Huh.
And that person also needs maybe a sense of like, hey, if you keep jumping off of things, eventually and you're not telling anybody, somebody may not catch you. Like, you have to use a little more common sense. Whereas Gideon was like, do I want to climb up on top of that even? You know?
Yeah.
And so I sat around and would encourage him to, like, climb a brick wall that was over on Shoal Creek and, like, we don't stop till we get to the top. We don't, you know, like, those kind of things to encourage him to be braver. Because I feel like I didn't get that till later in life.
Yeah, it's almost like the term that's coming to me is like conscious courage. Like you're courageous, but you have an understanding of why you're courageous and when it's appropriate to use courage. And you know, I'm really into this guy Graham Cook. He's like a kind of an alternative Christian pastor and has a bunch of books on spiritual warriorship and sonship in Christ. And one of the things that he's always talking about is how, you know, developing courage in and being bestowed of courage in your walk with God is such an interesting thing, because once you have a context that life isn't going to give you a challenge that you aren't able to overcome, you can kind of have this experience of becoming bigger than your challenges, or what he calls becoming bigger than your enemies. And I do get the sense that you can tune yourself into a level of clarity that shows you when it's appropriate to move forward in courage, even though it looks like all odds are against you. And one of the things that I'm trying to experiment with in my own life is like, when is it appropriate to take a stand for something versus just being like, well, they're doing their own thing and that doesn't really affect me. And, you know, I think disciplining people, whether it's your children or your employees, or even just telling people the truth as you see it and understand it, requires a tremendous amount of courage. And I'd be curious to hear kind of, you know, from when you first had children to where you're at now, do you feel like you have had to force yourself to have more courage just in learning how to properly communicate certain things to them without, you know, feeling like you're going to offend them?
I think, you know, you work on like not communicating things in anger. I think it can depend on where you are at too in communicating to them. And I think it is harder to discipline your kids sometimes in like you don't really want that. You'd rather they just got it.
Yeah.
And like, oh, you listened to me and I asked you to do this thing and you didn't. And you did it, instead of like, oh, I asked you to do this thing and you didn't, and then I asked you again and you didn't, and then I asked you, okay, then I said there's going to be consequences, and then, you know, okay, now I've got to give you consequences. This isn't what I wanted, you know, to do. So I think, yeah, there is a brave, and I think that's something we try to be conscious of, because I think you have to put structure around people to a degree, and there have to be consequences. And when you say there's going to be consequences, you have to live up to that. You know, if you don't, then it's like, you know. And I think in life there's consequences for our actions. It doesn't always feel that way. Sometimes you get away with stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they will too. We moved my daughter's bed the other day, and there was like a M&M's wrapper underneath it. because we were putting up this stuff on the wall and like a granola wrapper under there. I'm like, she's been sneaking food into her.
She's hoarding candy under her pillows.
Which I don't know when that happened, but it was one of those moments in like, you just kind of let it go because I'm like, I don't know when this happened. I don't know. And it was like one M&M's wrapper, so it only happened, I guess, once. But it seemed clear at some point she had brought some M&M's into her room, and that was under her bed.
Yeah, she could have concocted a whole sinister plan on how she's going to sneak those into the bedroom and eat them under the covers.
Next thing she's making methonyms, and then you're like, what? This all started so simple. Spiraled out of control. Yeah, so I mean, and I think, we've decided not to spank our kids, which is kind of controversial in some circles where I come from as being easy, but I think also trying to communicate and not trying to use that as a control mechanism. I think it's but it's also frustrating. There's times I'm like, when my kids don't listen, I'm like, if I beat you, you'd listen to me right now. But then I remember also, like, I was sometimes, rebellious to my parents, and at some point, like, do I really want to motivate them by fear?
Right.
Or I'm trying to motivate them by love and caring. And, like, so to be, like, vulnerable and be like, hey, it's really frustrating. It hurts Daddy's feelings when I ask you to do something and you don't do it. And I'm doing that for your better. When I'm asking you to eat something or to eat, I'm asking you to eat your vegetables because it's for your good, or, not to walk in traffic because it's good for you not to walk in traffic. You need to hold my hand all the way across the street because there's people that will hit you and there are people not paying attention. Somebody's on their phone. Like, I need to be able to yank you, and you need to look both ways, and if you don't look both ways, like, we're going to talk about it,
Yeah, well, and I think it requires a massive amount of personal awareness to be able to properly govern someone in that way because, most parents that I see are interacting from a place of anger, where they're hitting their kid or something. They're not doing that because they're mad at their kid. They're doing that because they feel so vulnerable in that moment that they're not able to protect their kid. And so the immediate reaction is, what is the quickest way for me to teach this kid not to do this so that I don't have to feel the discomfort of how vulnerable it is to be a parent? And I think to be able to transmute through that masking emotion of anger and down into actually what I really feel right now is, really concerned and afraid that my kid is going to get injured or that what they're doing might, affect them or others in a way that isn't benevolent to them and the community as a whole. If you can properly communicate those things. And I have, as an entrepreneur, when I'm communicating with my employees, rather than being like, God damn it, why'd you do it this way? I'm really trying to say, okay, the reason that I'm angry is because I'm afraid that if we continue to do things in the wrong way, that it's going to reflect negatively on us and that might ultimately mean that we have to shut the doors of the business. And so when instead of operating in anger, I can say, can you understand how, like, for me, this is super frustrating because I'm trying to keep the doors open here and, this could reflect poorly on our insurance policy or shut down this. And when you operate like this, it creates a lot more paperwork and a lot more fires that I have to put out. And usually when I have that level of transparency in relating why something that one of my employees did wasn't right, they get it, and they get it at a level where in their body they understand why that's not appropriate anymore. And I get the sense that that's what you're talking about with your kids, is like, instead of hitting them, which is the masking layer, like showing them the anger, what you're really doing is you're going underneath that anger and you're trying to be transparent, like, hey, Daddy gets really uncomfortable when you walk in the street because it's dangerous out there, and I really love you and I don't want to see you get injured. Can you hold Daddy's hand?
Yeah, and you have to bring in the reality of, like, if somebody hits you, you're dead, or it would be painful. Like, there's real consequences to a car hitting you. Yeah. Like, I feel like some people don't want to talk about the car. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, the car is out there, and the car, if it makes contact with you, it'll be bad. Most likely, if it's not death, it's lots of pain.
Yeah.
And it's like, let me tell you, so I want you trying to figure, one of the weirdest things was trying to be honest with those bombings, the package bombings here in Austin, and wanting to talk to your kids about the safety of just
so
stay
hold on,
the
let's
hell away
explain
from a
what
box.
let's explain what those were. So here, if you don't live in Austin, a few weeks ago, or maybe it was a month ago, we had this really weird thing where people were leaving unidentified boxes or packages places or on people's doorsteps, and then when those were opened or when a tripwire was snatched, the package would explode. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, I mean that seems to be what happened. And then there were tripwires that were set up in that one. I mean, once it really got crazy with the tripwires, then you were with the tripwire one, you were like, what in the world? How do I keep my kids safe? But I think for me, talking to them about that kind of evil being in the world, there's something uncomfortable because you want this more idyllic sense for your kids. And you want them to be able to interact with the world from a sense of courage and not from a sense of fear or whatever. But you're to further betterment, I have to tell them about these packages that exist and not to interact with packages that you see that don't, And of course, then there's a package comes in the house that's gone through the front desk and everything. Dad, what's going on? And you risk the amplifying it beyond what it actually is. But also you have, so you have to set that down. Okay, so that was something that was brought by a UPS person that JR checked and then I checked and we're good.
Yeah.
Because then it's every package becomes a sense of don't blow up, Dad.
Right.
So. You have to bring common sense, but to talk, it was kind of a weird thing that I didn't enjoy.
Yeah.
To have that conversation, but it's real and it's. Anyway, I feel like sometimes we do that to people. I listened in your first one with Dusty, and you talked about people being brutally honest with you, and it's we all kind of need that brutal. We need people to tell us about the bomb packages,
Yeah.
because those are real, and sometimes it's a metaphorical thing, maybe for things in our lives. Somebody that won't tell you, it's oh, you seem to have this drug habit. I'm not really going to talk to you about the all the drugs you're doing. It just seems, I notice you're totally emaciated and,
right.
But that takes us to an uncomfortable place. So, how's everything? How's your mom?
Yeah. Well, and what Dusty and I were talking about with the helicopter parents, this kind of idea that parents are afraid to discipline their kids, is a terrible thing that's happening in society right now, because I don't think that kids are getting a true sense of the way that reality operates, because they're being so massively sheltered and not being told the truth about things, and then not being taught the proper tools to be able to process truth and or reality as it shows up. And one of the things that I've been interested in is, okay, what are the different tools that I can put in my and others' tool belt that allows us to process whatever information comes up? And, I think a big part of that is just understanding how to properly communicate any fear that comes up. And, writing in a daily journal can be a really good way to have a daily release of some of the stresses and fear that have come in your life. And one of the practices that since I was a kid I've been involved in that I feel is really benevolent in Christianity is daily devotions. Going back to the Word or having some sort of an inspirational thing that you can start your day with, so that no matter how tragic or terrible reality is, at least you have a strong foundational kind of existential strategy. And for me, my strategy is reality is a mirror showing me what I need to feel and triggering me to properly express my emotions. For my brother, his is do the work. If you do the work and you're in integrity with your work, then reality is going to structure it around that good work and bring you things. I'd be, your film about the deer and the father teaching the deer or his son about kind of death in that manner. Did that stem out of the package thing or
no? That actually was going to be a comedy initially about two hipsters that hit a deer and decided to put it out, and it goes horribly bloody and is weird because I know a guy that he tweeted up that he almost hit a deer, and I was like, what would that guy do if he hit a deer? And how would that go? And then it turned into like totally two guys trying to kill a deer with like a VW like little click thing. and then I thought, what's more poignant and what's more valuable to me is like, how do we teach our kids about violence? But then also it turns into like how they twist that around. So,
do you find that your filmmaking is that you're wanting to teach more, or that you're wanting to use it as a mechanism for teaching your kids or others things, or is it more just like an honest expression of where you're at in that moment, and maybe it teaches, maybe it doesn't, but there's not that intention?
It's both for me. Like for the things that I direct, it's probably more of an honest artistic expression. For the things that I'm producing on, I'm probably a little more even judicious on what I'm trying to put out in the world a little bit, most of the time. So, I mean, it's kind of a project by project basis, but like for these, like it's like what kind of interests me. And the first one I did, honestly, it was just like I'd been producing, and my wife was like, "I feel like this producing is sucking the life out of you," and I was like, "I think you're right." And so I was like, I need to do something that I have creative control of, and so I wrote it while I was like getting my car oil changed, like the initial version and like a little treatment, and put it together, started writing it, and got it. And it was like a 3-minute short, that I put together. I was like, this is kind of my weird sense of humor, and this is what I want to do, and the buck stops with me, and I'm going to work with people that I want to, blah, blah, blah. So that was like totally creative control driven, and just doing something that I enjoy instead of, anyway. So both of them are that. And it was also to see if like I enjoyed directing. I hadn't really directed anything narrative, and so I didn't act in it. So, yeah, but I think I want people to have a sense of hope, or I want to help shift paradigms on some level with what I'm doing. I'm actually getting a chance to go to Brazil next week and cool. teach on there's kind of a group there, and learning how to use short films to create like spiritual dialogue or create like conversation, and being kind of a story consultant within that. And so it's the first time I've done that. I'm kind of excited and nervous that I'm totally, you're like, who am I to go tell people, what have I done? But I hope I don't come across like a complete idiot. So all that stuff. But I think, I am interested in that. Like how do we actually have a discussion, and how do we promote conversation?
How do you do that?
I think you make people uncomfortable. I think that's hard too, because you can't control what people pull from something. I had somebody watch my first film and say, "Yeah, to reclaim sex in your marriage, you've got to kill your children," is your message. That was not my message. And you're like, whoa, like you pulled something from it. Like I created something to make people uncomfortable. And laugh, and then feel guilty about laughing a little bit, but like, like that person's interpretation of like how they bring their own story to your story, you can't control that. There was a story I was a part of that I helped edit that was this girl that it's kind of a prodigal son story, and like the girl comes back home, and then she gets back on the bus and doesn't go home, and the father keeps loving her anyway, even though she never comes back home. And the bus we rented happened to have these kind of flames on it that I didn't realize. None of us had realized. And this person in the audience is like, I noticed the bus had the flames on it because she was going to hell. And you're like, it's a story about the Father's love never stops. Oh, God. Like there's a sense of like continuing to pursue her through the whole thing. And like this person had taken their sense or like, I have a friend that he became a Christian in high school, and they were telling the story of the woman that's going to be stoned, and Jesus says, let the one without sin throw the first stone. He's like, I totally thought Jesus was about to stone her. Like, save her for me, guys. Whack! And like his sense of like, and he had kind of grown up in a semi-church environment, and like that sense of, and so I think that's the hard thing with art in some ways, even when you're direct, people can misinterpret it. When you're not direct, people can misinterpret it. So there's no guarantee there, which I think can give me a little bit of disillusionment at times. Like, Even
Yeah.
now with where we are currently as a society, there's like more art than there's ever been.
Mm-hmm.
And people can absorb it through more avenues than ever. And it also seems like we're more divided and people are more in their silos than they have. And I'm like, are they, or are we just kind of exposing it? I don't know. But it's kind of disillusioning as an artist that like people can be consuming something and just using their confirmation bias to say like, yeah, it's just like what I think.
Well, and I think one of the interesting things about reality is that you're only picking out like a handful of data points. You know, there's millions of things that you could potentially perceive, and your brain only picks out things that are in line with, you know, what it thinks is going to help you survive. And I get the sense that when you are consuming information that matches one of your confirmation biases, you create this chemical cocktail inside of your body and your brain that's like firing dopamine, and so your brain sees that as a performance enhancing drug that your body is creating, and it says, oh, we can get so much more done when we have these chemicals going in our body, so let's make sure that we're only picking out the things that match that confirmation bias so that we can keep getting this dopamine hit from the information that provides that. And you know, that's why I've really been trying to challenge myself to watch uncomfortable things and to watch dissenting viewpoints, because I think that there's an even greater chemical, you know, cocktail that gets made when you move through that cognitive bias and have a more holistic viewpoint of the reality of the situation. And I get the sense that there's more opportunity for finding solution and communicating or finding the language to communicate things in a way that's more wholly benevolent to all people, because it's really easy to say, well, here's the solution for my group, and let's just go and fight for this solution and fuck everybody who doesn't believe that our solution is the best. But maybe there's an opportunity that we have right now to say, okay, well, clearly there's opposition to your solution from the other side. Is there a compromise solution that takes into account everybody's perspective? And, you know, I don't know that that's possible, and I don't know that we ever get to a point where we can all agree on something, and maybe we don't want to, because the contrast of life is kind of what inspires innovation. And I really do believe that reality gives us catalyzing events so that we can rise to certain challenges and recognize how powerful we really are as individuals and as communities. But it is interesting as artists, because so much art is a more individual expression, that it can be interpreted in so many ways. And you know, one of the things I've found in my own artistic expressions is that the more satisfied I am with something, the more it seems to be interpreted in the way that I wanted it to be interpreted. And maybe that's because my art has never been received at a massive level where you know, it can have that many misinterpretations. But you know, I think it's interesting what you're doing in Brazil, and who is that audience that you're speaking to? And when you're talking about creating compelling spiritual stories, what does that exactly mean? Or maybe what's an example of a compelling spiritual story or piece of art?
Well, I mean, for me, it is something like, oh, it's a story of a prodigal son, and how, you know, something like that. I think it can be a story on learning to forgive other people, you know, or something that has, but is a little more open-ended than that. You know, like, I think it has to be something that defies interpretation a little bit, but has a message that that hits you at kind of a gut level too. I think, you know, and sometimes the best way to do that is to totally reverse how things are. Like take abuse and put it from somebody that's not somebody we'd normally think of as an abuser. Like, can be more striking in seeing abuse and like trying to detail that. I think we get so like numb to like, oh yeah, I see where this is going. But like, I think how do you prick people a little bit to just kind of get them thinking?
Yeah.
And I think once you create an article of discussion, that can lead to other things, like where do we start off and where do we go and how does that detail? But I think the most important thing is just honestly to get people talking and questioning and trying to, and so a lot of that audience is more college students is who that group is dealing with. And so it's like, oh, how do we have these conversations? And so something that can kind of like get people moving or just thinking or in a mode of talking about something, like that's gonna be a big deal. Like, what about, they could make one about like how many times would you swim out to save drowning people? Imagine a boat turned over and everybody's drowning. How many times would you swim out there to save people? Would you do it once? Would you do it? Like when do you stop? How do you love people? And like, what is reasonable? What is what would you do? What should that person in that movie have done?
Yeah. Yeah, like a hard, open-ended question where, it's going to be different for every person depending on where they're at. Yeah, and those are always my favorite movies because I do like to be like, ooh, what would I have done in that situation? And maybe that's what you're talking about is like creating something that creates a vivid enough picture of a paradox and then putting the viewer in the center of that paradox so that they have to make their own call on how they would particularly interact with it.
Yeah. I think in some ways you're just trying to get people talking. And I think that's, as long as people are actually talking, they're communicating, they're getting to know each other. Hopefully, there's definitely people that are asking you a question. Like, how many times should you swim with her? The number is 17. 17 is the number. I measured it out, and that's the most glycogen he could muster based on his limb length. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good closing point because one of the things that I'm hoping to inspire with these podcasts is how valuable long-form conversation can be and actually, sitting in front of someone and having a real conversation and not hiding behind an avatar and understanding that everybody is multifaceted, multidimensional, they're filtering reality through their entire collection of life experiences. And until you have some semblance of what those past experiences have been, I don't think it makes sense to judge anyone's opinions. And I like art that asks open-ended questions, and I like, when I'm having conversations with people asking those open-ended questions because I think they are important questions, and I think learning how to think, not only in a constructive way, but philosophically can be a valuable experience, or it's at least been a valuable experience for me. So for people who want to follow the films that you're creating and the art that you're making and some of your ideas, is there a place where they can watch some of that stuff?
A lot of it's available on iTunes. You could go to like my Richard C. Jones on IMDb probably and see some of what I've done. I've also got a website, richardcjones.com. Follow me on Twitter as Richardo, I think is my name on there. I probably won't say a whole lot lately. I've dialed it back a little bit on the social media. But those are, I don't have like a Bible of everything that I've done. But the closest that you could probably see is IMDb, or go, if you want to contact me, go to the Twitter account, Richardo, or go to my website. You can contact me on there and I'll respond.
Cool, man. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for having this conversation. Thanks for hosting it in your beautiful place here in Austin. And for all of those who have been listening, thanks for tuning in with us.
Thank you.
Bye.